There is a strange truth about human behavior that most people never understand. When someone does not care about you, their actions are usually simple. They leave, they disconnect, they move on. There is very little confusion. But when someone deeply cares about you and is terrified of what those feelings mean, their behavior becomes complicated, contradictory, and difficult to understand. That is the paradox of the avoidant mind. Most people believe that love naturally creates closeness. They assume that when feelings grow stronger, connection grows stronger. But for someone operating from avoidance, the exact opposite can happen. The more meaningful the relationship becomes, the more intense their fear becomes. The closer they feel to you, the stronger their urge to create distance. Many people misinterpret this behavior. They see withdrawal and assume there must be a lack of interest. They see silence and assume there must be indifference. They see hesitation and assume there must be uncertainty about the relationship. But sometimes the reality is much deeper than that. Sometimes distance is not created by the absence of feelings. Sometimes distance is created by the presence of feelings that feel too overwhelming to handle. Human beings are driven by two powerful forces. One force pulls us toward connection, love, belonging, and intimacy. The other force pushes us away from pain, uncertainty, rejection, and vulnerability. Most healthy relationships find balance between these forces, but the avoidant individual often experiences them as a battle. Part of them wants love. Another part of them fears what love demands. Because love requires exposure. Love requires trust. Love requires surrender. Love requires allowing another human being to see parts of you that have been carefully hidden from the world. For someone who learned early in life that emotional dependence leads to disappointment, vulnerability feels dangerous. Their mind developed a strategy. Stay self-sufficient. Stay independent. Stay in control. Never need anyone too much. At first, this strategy seems powerful. It creates strength. It creates resilience. It creates the appearance of confidence. But hidden beneath that armor is a fear that often goes unnoticed. The fear is not always losing someone. The fear is needing someone. That distinction changes everything. When an avoidant begins developing genuine feelings, they may suddenly feel something they have spent years avoiding. Emotional dependence begins to emerge. Thoughts become occupied by another person. The relationship starts to matter. The outcome starts to matter. And that creates discomfort. Because now there is something valuable that could potentially be lost. Now there is someone whose opinion matters. Now there is someone capable of causing emotional pain. The avoidant nervous system interprets this growing attachment as risk, not because love is dangerous, but because vulnerability feels dangerous. This is why you often see strange behavior patterns. One day they move closer. The next day they create distance. One moment they seem deeply invested. The next moment they appear emotionally unavailable. To an outside observer, this looks irrational. To the avoidant mind, it feels like survival. They are not simply reacting to you. They are reacting to what you represent. You represent connection. You represent intimacy. You represent emotional exposure. You represent a future that requires trust. And trust is difficult for people whose experiences taught them that trust can lead to pain. The tragedy is that many avoidants genuinely desire the very thing they run from. They want connection. They want understanding. They want companionship. They want love. But wanting something and feeling safe receiving it are not the same thing. This is where wisdom becomes essential. You must understand that fear often disguises itself as resistance. Fear disguises itself as procrastination. Fear disguises itself as withdrawal. Fear disguises itself as criticism. Fear disguises itself as emotional distance. The behavior you see on the surface is not always the true story. Every behavior has a deeper motivation beneath it. When someone is scared to love, they often begin creating reasons not to love. They focus on imperfections. They exaggerate problems. They search for flaws. They convince themselves that distance is the logical choice. Why? Because the mind is attempting to protect itself from uncertainty. Protection becomes more important than connection. Safety becomes more important than growth. Control becomes more important than intimacy. Yet there is a spiritual lesson hidden inside this struggle. Every meaningful transformation requires courage. Every meaningful relationship requires courage. Every meaningful act of love requires courage. Not because love is weak, but because love demands honesty. Love asks us to step beyond fear. Love asks us to trust despite uncertainty. Love asks us to remain open despite past wounds. The greatest prison is not rejection. The greatest prison is allowing fear to decide your future. Many people spend years protecting themselves from pain while accidentally protecting themselves from love as well. They build walls so effective that pain cannot enter, but neither can connection, neither can intimacy, neither can the profound experience of being fully known and fully accepted. The truth is that fear and love rarely occupy the same space for long. One eventually becomes stronger than the other, and the direction of your life is determined by which one you choose to follow. If someone is scared to love you, their behavior may reveal conflict rather than certainty. Their actions may reveal struggle rather than indifference. Their distance may reveal fear rather than absence of feeling. But there is another lesson that must also be understood. You cannot heal someone else's fear for them. You cannot force another person into emotional readiness. You cannot love someone into transformation if they are unwilling to confront the beliefs that keep them trapped. Growth is always an inside job. Healing is always a personal decision. Transformation begins when a person becomes more committed to truth than comfort. The most powerful thing you can do is remain grounded in your own value. Do not chase validation. Do not abandon your self-respect. Do not make another person's fear your identity. Recognize your worth. Recognize your purpose. Recognize that genuine love does not require you to shrink yourself in order to be chosen. The healthiest relationships emerge when two people are willing to face themselves honestly. When fear loses its authority, connection becomes possible. When self-protection no longer controls every decision, intimacy can finally grow. And that is the deeper message. When an avoidant is scared to love you, what you are witnessing is not merely relationship behavior. You are witnessing a battle between fear and connection, between self-protection and vulnerability, between old wounds and new possibilities. The question is never whether love exists. The question is whether fear will continue to stand in its way. The moment a person chooses courage over protection, truth over avoidance, and growth over fear, everything begins to change. Because love was never the problem. Fear was. And when fear loses its grip, the heart finally becomes free to do what it was created to do. Connect, trust, grow, and love without running away from its own deepest desires. Many people assume that when someone pulls away emotionally, avoids serious conversations, or seems uncomfortable with closeness, it must mean they do not care. But human psychology is rarely that simple. One of the most misunderstood realities of avoidant behavior is that fear of vulnerability often disguises itself as emotional distance. What appears to be a lack of feeling on the surface can sometimes be the result of feelings that have become too powerful to comfortably manage. Vulnerability is one of the most challenging experiences a human being can face. It requires exposing parts of yourself that cannot be protected by logic, status, achievement, or control. When you become vulnerable, you allow another person to see your hopes, your fears, your insecurities, and your emotional needs. For someone with avoidant tendencies, this level of openness can feel far more threatening than most people realize. The avoidant mind is often built around self-protection. At some point in life, whether through childhood experiences, disappointment, rejection, or emotional neglect, a belief may have formed that depending on others is dangerous. The lesson learned was simple. If you do not rely on anyone, you cannot be hurt by anyone. Over time, independence becomes more than a strength. It becomes a shield. The challenge begins when genuine feelings develop. As emotional attachment grows, so does the possibility of loss. The relationship starts to matter. The other person's opinions begin to carry weight. Their presence becomes meaningful. Suddenly, there is something valuable that could potentially be taken away. For the avoidant individual, this creates internal tension. Part of them wants connection, while another part desperately wants to maintain emotional safety. As a result, vulnerability often triggers withdrawal. Instead of moving closer, they may become distant. Instead of expressing their feelings, they may hide them. Instead of embracing intimacy, they may focus on reasons to create space. To others, this behavior can seem confusing or contradictory. Yet from their perspective, distance feels like protection. This is why emotional distance should not always be interpreted at face value. Sometimes it is not a reflection of what a person feels. It is a reflection of what they fear. The stronger the emotional connection becomes, the more vulnerable they feel, and the more their protective instincts activate. True growth begins when a person recognizes this pattern within themselves. Real strength is not found in avoiding vulnerability, but in learning to tolerate it. The deepest relationships are built not on perfection or control, but on the willingness to be seen as you truly are. When fear no longer dictates behavior, emotional distance begins to fade, and authentic connection becomes possible. The courage to be vulnerable is ultimately the courage to love, and every meaningful relationship requires that leap of faith. One of the most confusing experiences in relationships occurs when an avoidant person seems to grow distant, just as the connection is becoming stronger. Most people expect emotional closeness to create more closeness. They believe that as trust develops, communication improves, affection increases, and commitment becomes easier. Yet with avoidant individuals, the opposite can sometimes occur. The stronger the bond becomes, the greater their urge to retreat. This behavior often leaves others questioning what went wrong, when, in reality, the growing connection itself may be what triggered the withdrawal. To understand this dynamic, it is important to recognize that avoidant individuals often experience intimacy differently from others. While they may deeply desire love, companionship, and emotional connection, they also associate closeness with vulnerability. As long as a relationship remains casual or emotionally limited, they can feel relatively comfortable. There is little risk, little emotional exposure, and little fear of being hurt. But as feelings deepen, the emotional stakes begin to rise. The relationship starts to matter more. The person's presence becomes more significant. The possibility of loss becomes more real. And with that comes anxiety. For many avoidants, emotional closeness activates old protective mechanisms. Their nervous system interprets increasing intimacy as a potential threat rather than a source of safety. This reaction is often automatic and unconscious. They may not even understand why they suddenly feel overwhelmed. They simply know that something inside them is telling them to create space. This is why you may notice a pattern of approach and retreat. They move closer, enjoy the connection, and begin developing deeper feelings. Then, almost unexpectedly, they pull away. They become less available, less expressive, or more focused on independence. To the other person, this shift can feel like rejection. But internally, the avoidant is often struggling with conflicting desires. One part of them wants the relationship to continue growing. Another part fears what that growth requires. What makes this particularly difficult is that the retreat is not always a sign of reduced feelings. In some cases, it is the opposite. The stronger the emotional investment becomes, the stronger the fear becomes as well. They may withdraw because the relationship has become important, not because it has become meaningless. This pattern reveals a powerful truth about human behavior. People do not always run from what they dislike. Sometimes they run from what they desperately want, because wanting it makes them feel vulnerable. The fear of emotional dependence, disappointment, or loss can become so intense that distance feels safer than connection. Growth begins when an avoidant person learns that closeness is not the enemy. Real intimacy is not a threat to freedom, but an opportunity for deeper human connection. When they stop viewing vulnerability as danger and start viewing it as strength, the need to retreat gradually loses its power. Only then can love grow without being interrupted by fear, and only then can a meaningful relationship reach its full potential. One of the deepest fears within the avoidant mindset is not necessarily love itself, but what love appears to require. To most people, love represents warmth, connection, trust, and companionship. To an avoidant individual, however, love can sometimes feel like a threat to something they value above all else: freedom and control. This is why many avoidants struggle when relationships become serious. The issue is often not a lack of feelings but a fear that those feelings will take away their sense of independence. At the core of avoidant psychology is a strong desire for self-reliance. Many avoidants learned early in life that depending on others could lead to disappointment, rejection, criticism, or emotional pain. As a result, they developed a powerful belief that the safest way to live is to depend primarily on themselves. Over time, independence became more than a preference. It became an identity. Being in control of their emotions, decisions, and personal space feels secure. It allows them to avoid situations where they might feel powerless or vulnerable. The challenge arises when love enters the picture. Genuine love naturally creates emotional investment. When you care deeply about someone, their actions affect you. Their presence matters. Their opinions carry weight. Their absence is felt. For someone who has spent years protecting their independence, this can feel unsettling. Suddenly, another person has the ability to influence their emotional world. To many avoidants, this influence can be interpreted as a loss of control. They may begin to think, what if I need this person too much? What if they leave? What if I become dependent on them? What if I lose myself in this relationship? These fears often exist beneath the surface, unnoticed even by the avoidant themselves. Yet they quietly shape behavior. As feelings deepen, they may start creating emotional distance. They may seek more time alone, avoid conversations about commitment, or become uncomfortable when the relationship requires greater intimacy. From the outside, it may seem like they are losing interest. Internally, they may actually be struggling with the fear of losing control over their own emotional life. What makes this pattern so tragic is that love and freedom are not opposites. Healthy love does not imprison a person. It does not erase individuality or independence. In its healthiest form, love supports growth, encourages authenticity, and allows two people to remain fully themselves while building something meaningful together. The avoidant often sees only the potential risks of connection while overlooking its rewards. They focus on what they might lose rather than what they might gain. Their fear tells them that closeness threatens freedom, when in reality, true freedom comes from no longer being controlled by fear. Real transformation occurs when an avoidant discovers that trust does not weaken them, and what vulnerability does not make them powerless. The strongest relationships are not built on control, but on mutual respect, honesty, and emotional courage. When the fear of losing freedom is replaced by the understanding that healthy love can actually expand life rather than restrict it, the walls around the heart begin to come down. Only then can love be experienced not as a threat, but as one of life's greatest strengths. One of the most frustrating aspects of dealing with an avoidant person is trying to make sense of their mixed signals. One day they seem deeply engaged, affectionate, and emotionally present. They initiate conversations, show genuine interest, and make you feel valued. The next day, however, they appear distant, distracted, or emotionally unavailable. Their actions seem to contradict their previous behavior, leaving you wondering whether they truly care or whether the connection was ever real in the first place. Most people interpret mixed signals as a sign of dishonesty, manipulation, or lack of interest. While those possibilities can certainly exist in some situations, avoidant psychology often reveals a different explanation. Mixed signals are frequently the outward expression of an internal conflict. They are not necessarily evidence that the avoidant lacks feelings. Instead, they often indicate that the person is struggling to reconcile two opposing desires that exist simultaneously within them. On one side is the desire for connection. On the other side is the desire for protection. The avoidant wants closeness, companionship, and understanding just like anyone else. They enjoy feeling connected to another person. They appreciate support, affection, and emotional intimacy. Yet at the same time, these experiences can trigger fears that have been buried for years. The closer they become to someone, the more vulnerable they feel. The more vulnerable they feel, the stronger their instinct becomes to protect themselves. This creates a cycle that often appears confusing from the outside. When they feel safe, they move toward connection. They become warm, attentive, and emotionally available. But as intimacy deepens, fear begins to emerge. Suddenly, they start questioning the relationship. They may need space, become less communicative, or focus intensely on maintaining their independence. Then, once enough distance has been created, and the pressure of vulnerability decreases, they often feel drawn back toward connection again. This push-and-pull behavior can create emotional whiplash for the other person. It may seem as though the avoidant is constantly changing their mind. In reality, they are often experiencing an internal battle between attachment and self-protection. Neither side completely wins, which is why their behavior appears inconsistent. Understanding this dynamic does not mean excusing hurtful behavior or ignoring unhealthy patterns. Boundaries remain important in every relationship. However, recognizing the source of mixed signals can provide valuable insight. It helps explain why someone may appear sincere in one moment and distant in the next, without necessarily intending to deceive anyone. The deeper lesson is that human behavior is often more complex than it appears. People are not always fighting against others. Sometimes they are fighting against their own fears. The mixed signals of an avoidant frequently reveal a person standing between two powerful forces: the desire to love and the fear of what love might require. Until that internal conflict is resolved, their actions may continue to reflect both directions at once. True healing begins when they learn that vulnerability is not a threat to survive, but a necessary part of creating the connection they genuinely desire. One of the greatest misunderstandings in relationships is assuming that emotional withdrawal always means rejection. When someone becomes distant, stops expressing their feelings, takes longer to respond, or suddenly seems unavailable, the natural reaction is often to believe that they no longer care. For many people, distance feels personal. It feels like proof that the relationship has lost value in the other person's eyes. Yet, in avoidant psychology, emotional withdrawal is frequently driven by something very different. More often than not, it is an act of self-protection rather than a deliberate rejection of another person. To understand this, it is important to recognize that avoidant individuals often experience emotional intensity differently. While closeness may feel comforting and exciting at first, it can eventually create a level of vulnerability that feels overwhelming. As feelings deepen, so does the sense of exposure. The relationship becomes more meaningful, which means there is more to lose. What may feel like normal intimacy to one person can feel emotionally risky to someone who has spent years relying on independence as a primary source of safety. When this discomfort arises, the avoidant nervous system often activates protective responses. Instead of moving toward the discomfort and processing it, they instinctively create distance from whatever is triggering those emotions. This distance can take many forms. They may become quieter, spend more time alone, focus intensely on work or personal goals, avoid emotional conversations, or reduce the amount of affection they express. To the person on the receiving end, these behaviors can feel like rejection, but internally, the avoidant is often attempting to manage feelings that have become difficult to handle. The key distinction is that rejection says, "I do not want you." Self-protection says, "I do not know how to handle what I feel." Those two realities may look similar on the surface, but they come from very different emotional places. Many avoidants are not running from the other person. They are running from the fear, vulnerability, and uncertainty that the relationship awakens within them. They may care deeply, while simultaneously feeling overwhelmed by the emotional demands that come with caring. The stronger the attachment becomes, the stronger the instinct to retreat can become as well. This creates a painful paradox. The very person they want to feel close to becomes the person who triggers their deepest fears. As a result, withdrawal becomes a coping strategy. It provides temporary relief from emotional pressure, even though it often damages the connection they are trying to protect. Understanding this dynamic does not mean that emotional withdrawal is healthy, or that it should be accepted without boundaries. Relationships require communication, accountability, and emotional presence. However, recognizing the motivation behind the behavior can change how it is interpreted. What appears to be indifference may actually be fear. What appears to be rejection may actually be an attempt to regain a sense of safety. The deeper lesson is that people often protect themselves in ways that unintentionally hurt others. Emotional withdrawal is one of the clearest examples of this reality. True growth begins when a person learns that safety is not found in running from difficult emotions, but in developing the courage to face them. When self-protection is no longer the dominant force, genuine connection can finally replace distance, and love can be expressed without fear controlling every step. The journey of an avoidant individual is not ultimately about relationships. It is about fear. Relationships simply become the place where that fear is most clearly revealed. Beneath the emotional distance, the hesitation, the withdrawal, and the need for control, often lies a deeper struggle, the battle between the desire for connection and the fear of what connection requires. This is why real healing begins when fear no longer controls the desire for connection. Until that happens, even the strongest feelings can become trapped behind walls that were originally built for protection. Every avoidant person carries a story. Somewhere along the way, they learned that emotional vulnerability was risky. Perhaps trust was broken. Perhaps emotional needs were ignored. Perhaps closeness led to disappointment, criticism, or pain. Whatever the source, the lesson became deeply embedded. Stay independent, stay guarded, and never rely too much on anyone else. Over time, these beliefs became automatic. They were no longer conscious decisions, but survival strategies, operating beneath the surface. The problem is that what protects a person from pain can also prevent them from experiencing love. The walls, built to keep out hurt, eventually keep out intimacy as well. The habits that once provided emotional safety begin to create emotional loneliness. The avoidant may convince themselves that they are protecting their peace, but deep inside, there is often a longing for genuine connection that never fully disappears. This is where healing becomes necessary. Healing does not begin when someone finds the perfect partner. Healing does not begin when another person proves they are trustworthy. Healing begins when the avoidant becomes willing to confront the fears that have been shaping their behavior for years. The greatest breakthrough occurs when they realize that vulnerability is not weakness. For much of their life, they may have viewed emotional openness as dangerous. They may have believed that needing someone makes a person weak or dependent. Yet true emotional strength is not the absence of vulnerability. True strength is the ability to remain open even when there is uncertainty. Fear always promises protection, but it often delivers isolation. Connection always requires risk, but it also creates the possibility of love, growth, and transformation. At some point, every avoidant faces a choice: continue allowing fear to dictate decisions, or begin choosing connection despite the presence of fear. That choice is not made once. It is made repeatedly. It is made every time they choose honesty over withdrawal, every time they communicate instead of shutting down, every time they stay present during discomfort rather than escaping from it. The remarkable thing about healing is that fear does not have to disappear completely before change can happen. Courage is not the absence of fear. Courage is moving forward, even when fear is present. The avoidant who learns this lesson begins to experience relationships differently. Intimacy no longer feels like a threat to survive. Vulnerability no longer feels like a loss of control. Connection no longer feels like a danger to freedom. Instead, love becomes what it was always meant to be: a partnership between two imperfect people who are willing to be seen, known, and understood. When fear loses its position as the leader, the heart is finally free to move toward what it has always wanted. That is where true healing begins. Not when fear disappears, but when it no longer has the power to control the desire for connection. In that moment, growth becomes possible, relationships become deeper, and love is finally given the space to flourish.